History tells us that kings ruled through strength and honor, that crowns symbolized unity and thrones represented order. But power is rarely built on truth alone. Behind royal ceremonies were stories designed to be believed, not questioned. And some of those stories still shape the world we live in today. Royal authority was never introduced as something human or fragile. From the very beginning, kings and queens were portrayed as chosen beings elevated above ordinary people. Coronation ceremonies were carefully designed performances. Sacred symbols, religious language, and public rituals worked together to convince entire populations that royal power was inevitable. When people believed a ruler was chosen by divine will, obedience followed naturally. Doubt felt dangerous. Questioning authority felt like questioning destiny itself. Over time, belief replaced evidence, faith replaced reason, and power no longer needed explanation, only acceptance. But divine authority could never be proven. It only survived because no one was allowed to question it. Royal bloodlines were treated as sacred truth, passed down through generations without challenge. But lineage was rarely as pure or ancient as it appeared. Names were quietly added to family records, rival branches were erased. Marriages were rewritten to appear politically meaningful rather than convenient. By controlling ancestry, royal families controlled legitimacy. The past was adjusted whenever the present required stability. What looked like ancient tradition was often the result of repeated revision, a history edited over centuries to support whoever sat on the throne. Yet these lies did more than secure crowns. They justified decisions that changed the lives of millions. Publicly, rulers spoke of peace, stability, and protection. Privately, power was calculated with cold precision. Inside council chambers, borders were negotiated without witnesses. Treaties were. Wars were planned long before the public ever heard a justification. The people were shown ceremonies and speeches meant to inspire trust. The real decisions were made in silence, hidden behind stone walls and closed doors. History, as it turned out, was often decided long before it was explained, but secrecy alone was not enough. Memory itself had to be controlled. Not everyone was allowed to record history. Only trusted scribes were permitted to write what future generations would read. Errors were corrected. Unfavorable events were softened or removed. Entire chapters vanished without explanation. What survived was not always what truly happened, but what rulers believed should be remembered. Over time, edited records replaced reality. The lie became familiar, and familiarity slowly turned deception into accepted truth. Still, some noticed the missing pieces, and asking questions would soon come at a cost. Not everyone accepted the official version of history. As records accumulated over generations, small inconsistencies began to appear. Dates did not align. Battles appeared in multiple versions with different outcomes. Entire figures vanished between editions of the same historical account. These early doubters were not rebels or conspirators. They were scholars, archivists, and record keepers whose only crime was paying attention. They compared texts. They questioned omissions. And slowly, they realized that history was not incomplete by accident. Asking questions felt necessary, but also dangerous. Because questioning the past meant challenging the authority built upon it. And the crown had no tolerance for uncertainty. The response was rarely public or violent. It was quiet, methodical. Some scholars were removed from their positions. Others were pressured to retract their findings. A few simply disappeared from the historical record altogether. Their books vanished from libraries. Their names were omitted from future citations. Official silence replaced open punishment. Fear spread without a single announcement. Everyone understood the message. Truth was no longer a pursuit. It was a risk. But fear can only suppress truth. It cannot erase its consequences. Royal deception did not remain confined to palaces or archives. Eventually, it reached the world outside. Wars were framed as defensive actions, as unavoidable responses to imagined threats, as moral obligations to protect the realm. But many of these conflicts began with false claims carefully constructed long before the first soldier marched. Entire populations were mobilized by stories that had already been decided behind closed doors. Truth became irrelevant, loyalty became mandatory. Men and women paid the price for decisions made by those who would never stand on the battlefield. And when the fighting ended, the lies were not buried with the dead. When wars ended, devastation remained. Cities were left in ruins, families were fractured beyond repair. But official histories rarely focused on loss. Defeat was softened. Mistakes were reframed as sacrifice. Victory once again determined the narrative. What did not fit the story was quietly removed. The people remembered pain, history remembered glory. And once more, truth was sacrificed to preserve power. But power was already preparing for the future. Each generation inherited more than land and titles. They inherited carefully maintained deception. Young rulers were taught which stories must survive, which events should never be revisited, and which truths must remain buried. Lies became tradition. Tradition became unquestionable history. By the time crowns began to lose their power, the narratives they created had already shaped borders, cultures, and belief systems across the world. Even when kingdoms fall, the lies they created often remain. No crown lasts forever. Empires that once ruled continents eventually collapsed under their own weight. Revolutions, economic collapse, and internal conflict stripped monarchies of their authority. Palaces emptied, thrones lost their meaning. Yet when crowns fell, something unexpected remained untouched. The stories built to protect royal power survived. History books still reflected the old narratives. Borders drawn under deception remained unchanged. The collapse of power did not undo the lies that justified it. The crown was gone, but its influence was not. Modern borders appear fixed and unquestionable, but many were drawn centuries ago in secrecy. Lines placed on maps by royal decree now define nations, cultures, and conflicts. What began as political convenience became permanent reality. Generations inherited boundaries without knowing the lies that created them. The past was never revisited, only accepted. History moved forward, carrying ancient deception into the modern world. And most people never ask why those lines exist. A lie repeated long enough begins to feel familiar. And familiarity slowly turns into truth. Royal narratives pass through generations of education, literature, and public memory. What was once propaganda became accepted history. Facts were memorized without context. Events were taught without questioning motive. The lie no longer needed protection. It had become invisible. But invisibility does not mean permanence. Statues remain long after rulers are gone. Symbols survive when power fades. They stand as reminders of authority, legitimacy, and tradition. Few remember what they truly represent. Over time, symbols stop being questioned. They become background. But even without power, symbols continue shaping belief, quietly reinforcing old narratives. And belief is still one of the strongest forces in history. Royal power did not disappear, it evolved. Control moved away from crowns and thrones, but the techniques remained the same. Stories still shape belief, narratives still justify decisions, and history is still written by those who control information. The world may no longer be ruled by kings, but it is still ruled by stories. And some of those stories began centuries ago. The most powerful stories are not the loudest ones. They are the stories no one thinks to question. Over time, royal narratives blended into education, culture, and identity. They shaped how people understood authority, conflict, and legitimacy. When a story feels old enough, it feels permanent. When it feels permanent, it stops being examined. Truth does not disappear. It simply becomes harder to recognize beneath layers of repetition. And repetition is the strongest shield any lie can have. Not all records were destroyed. Some were hidden. Archives sealed, documents misplaced, entire collections forgotten. Time protected what power tried to erase. And occasionally, fragments of the truth resurface. But discovery does not guarantee acceptance. Because truth challenges comfort and comfort resists change. Finding the truth is only the beginning. When hidden records emerge, history becomes unstable. Familiar narratives begin to fracture. People are forced to reconsider what they were taught, to separate tradition from truth, and authority from evidence. Rewriting history is uncomfortable. It forces societies to confront the cost of belief. But discomfort is often the first step toward understanding. The greatest royal lie was never about power. It was about permanence, convincing the world that authority, borders, and history were fixed, unchangeable. But nothing in history is permanent, except the stories we choose to protect. Once the illusion fades, the crown loses its final defense, and the truth no longer needs permission. History is more than dates and names. It is a record of belief, power, and silence. If you want to uncover the stories hidden beneath tradition and authority, and explore the truths history left behind, subscribe and continue this journey. Because the past is never truly gone. It's only waiting to be questioned.